Thank you for surviving and coming back. We're going to shift gears a little bit, obviously, because this will be a panel-type discussion, and we're going to shift the scale, hopefully, of the conversation a little bit. I would ask this. We have a couple of things going on. One is we do have a hard stop for a few of the panelists at 3 o'clock, so we will disband in a formal sense at then, but if there's an ongoing conversation, we'll let that keep going and open it up a little bit. I do want to start, hopefully, with some actual questions for the panelists, kind of have them actually talk about stuff. To start with, if you have a question, would you scribble it down on something, hopefully in a marginally legible way, and have Boris or Adam or someone grab it and bring it up to me, and I will try to deal those. But I at least initially want to, avoid opening it up fully, and then depending where the conversation goes, we can open it up to a little bit more of a roundtable conversation. But what I want to start with today, first of all, is just a brief introduction. I'm not going to go into the long list of accomplishments that everyone up here has done. So I just want to give you a quick overview. So just to my right is Kim. She's a brand strategist. She and I have actually worked together before on a number of things. And next to her is David, innovation consulting, both in his own personal business that he consults, with other groups and businesses and people, but also at Columbia University where he actually teaches this as well. Next is Martha, who has apparently worked in all the stands, is an international urban planner, but really functioning at the scale of policy and, done way too many interesting things to list. And then finally we have Anna, who is on faculty here and is working in and around social justice, specifically dealing with climate and with people and et cetera and stuff like that. I think the commonality here, I guess I should say, and I'm Adam, and my work really involves human experience design and issues sort of surrounding that. And I have not done anything ever specifically with climate change, but a lot of the work that I do obviously impacts that. And I think, as I mentioned in the very beginning, those of us who sort of started this conversation came together because we found that this was a place we overlapped. And I think it's something that no matter what you do or what you're involved in, this is a relevant issue. It has to be a relevant issue. But I want to shift the scale of the conversation a little bit to begin with from where we were sort of dealing with the sort of local and the immediate, and ask what begins to happen if we open the door to this conversation at scale. And I'd like to think about that scale as all the way from one person with their roommate, which we heard about today, but all the way up to the, beyond that, up to global, really, and what begins to happen. And I think everyone here is going to have interesting things to say about what happens when the system is that big. And the other, I think, sort of critical part of that conversation then is when the system actually gets, frankly, once it even gets to the scale of 2 roommates, suddenly nobody agrees, right? And we are a group of people who, on the whole, are sympathetic to each other. In this room, in this school, in this city. And we may not completely agree on this and that, but on the whole, as we begin to scale up, we find things that are surprising, where we're like, oh, I thought we agreed, but then, we don't. And I'll give you an example from my life. Can I get a show of hands? How many people in here are gun owners? I am a gun owner. So that's an interesting issue I find amongst people who often have aligned views. Now, I use it for sport, and if you want to yell at me later about it, we can talk about that. And it's carefully controlled, and I grew up down south, and all these different things. But very quickly, you start to find that those sorts of things take place. And then when you start to think about it at the level of policy, at the level of government, at the level of businesses, how do you actually make real change happen? We have to deal with the fact that there's sort of difference. So, to kick off that discussion, actually, I'm going to ask David to relate a story that he told me just this morning about both perhaps one of the more extreme versions of disagreement, but also about how sometimes the tool, the solution, the way around it is so easy and yet so hard to get to because we're trying so hard to do so much more. So can I have you share that story with us?
Sure. It was an issue, as Adam indicated. It was nothing actually to do about sustainability. It was actually a little hint. It's something in the Middle East. So highly emotional. People have very strong opinions, a global issue. We were running an advocacy campaign. And what I was mentioning to Adam, what I thought was interesting was we did this whole bunch of polling about what was that defining moment that changed your opinion on the issue. So we asked a bunch of people, like, when did you get the aha moment? Yes, I agree with this issue in the way that we wanted to influence people. And so we expected most of the answers would be, oh, I came across, there was this amazing op-ed, I don't know, in the New York Times, or I saw this billboard, or this particular message. And invariably, that was never the answer. It was never, I read something, I heard something, a particular message. Almost the most important one was, I had a conversation with this particular person, and particularly in our field, it was with faith-based leaders. They had sort of a dinner, intimate dinner, and because I knew this person, it shifted my opinion. Almost the vast majority, if not everyone. And so we had this sort of bucket of money, and it was interesting. Instead of doing sort of a traditional earned media campaign or a paid media campaign, we put everything almost into sort of intimate dinners with sort of faith leaders and different people getting together. And again, the sort of impact of that was tremendous. So what I thought was interesting, because it touches upon what you said before in terms of scale, like in some ways, the individual relationship, at least in this particular field, but I think it applies equally to sustainability, it's about personal relationships. That's the only way really to change people's mind. But by definition, it's really local. And so how do we scale local relationships? And I think that was sort of the conversation we're having.
Yeah, so now let me ask, I'm going to ask Kim a question, and I want to sort of add to that, or maybe, you can either riff off that or sort of relate more specifically. Like you mentioned earlier, we were having a conversation sort of in the middle of today about the pace at which a lot of the innovation actually occurs in a kind of a corporate situation. Like in an afternoon, you often will sit down with a brand and like just rewrite everything completely. But at the same time, it's weirdly impersonal as a result, I think, right? So I'm curious, if we look in that through that lens, the lens of that kind of stuff, like what are the sort of what are the ways either that change can actually occur, but also more importantly, how does that relate then to this idea, if the local's so important, then it's not when you're dealing with these massive brands who may be messaging local impact or local concern, but maybe aren't really at the kind of level when you get into the the E-suite, they're not necessarily thinking that way. Like, what do you think?
I think as we think about how to impact change, there's a bit of an architecture of who we talk to, right? So you think of the sort of grassroots community level as those who sort of maintain and keep the vision going and running. But then there's what I would call the culture leaders, whether that's the business leaders or influencers, or in this world, probably a little bit of like the startup engineers, evolvers. Like, they have to be a part of the conversation too, because they're pushing thought forward, but the culture leaders are sort of taking the baton and making sure that things persist and are happening on an ongoing way. I think sort of where the challenge is, and we talked about this a little bit, those people don't speak the same language, right? So if you think of sort of the tech and innovation world, they're all about rapid prototyping. How quickly can you go in and solve a problem? How do you hack current institutions? But a lot of the infrastructure in place to deliver on massive social change and policy is very slow, almost academic. So it's really a conversation of how do you even get them to start talking the same language to solve problems.
Okay, so then I'm going to turn to Anna on this one then. So because you kind of come from the other side, right? You're part of that side that is more academic, at least at its inception, and you're putting that message out. You're the ones, in a way, that you're referring to talking back. What does the conversation look like from your perspective in terms of that scale? Like, what are the challenges? What are the struggles? What are the opportunities? Like, where are the spaces that we can, sort of the cracks we can get in and begin to break open the system so we can have a different kind of conversation than we are?
So the key word there is system, right? And looking at systems change. And having worked as an academic activist, really with frontline communities and with social movements, really intersectional social movements for social justice and change. The key has been, how do you scale social movements to the same scale of the power of the challenge, right? So if you think capitalism is the problem, if you think global economic structures are creating climate crisis, and you think they're the drivers of the climate crisis, do you have a political agenda and a social movement powerful enough and strategic enough to present a challenge or present an alternative? And because social movements have been so fractured in the last 30, 40 years, and so much of the politics has been focused on the nation state, right? How do we negotiate the Paris Climate Agreement? How do we get our own country to pass a clean power plan? But not focused enough on the global drivers of environmental policy, which are the private sector, right? The private sector is actually creating and making many more decisions about environmental policy through money, right? Follow the money. And so I think the challenge has been to couple the scaling of social movements, the intersection of social movements, getting people to think as a collective, right? Not just as the individual. I'm an individual consumer. Well, you're also part of a collective. You know, what collective are you part of? What are you targeting? Not just your consumer behavior, but what is the actual driver of the consumption and production that you're seeing in the stores? And so trying to drive people upstream as a collective, not just as individuals, and being strategic about it, because it's good to have collective social action and social movements, but what are the policy triggers that are going to respond to those global forces, right? What are the regulations? What are the policies? What are the taxes that are going to be needed? And innovations, right? And technologies. Those are all part of the mix. So I always challenge my students to follow the money, follow the power, right? And I believe, this is my own belief from working with frontline communities and in frontline communities and being part of a frontline community, is that those frontline communities that are already being impacted and worst hit with climate, they have an alternative discourse that can be very powerful, but has to be leveraged, right? That has to be part of a larger, and a strategic, has to have a strategic target, which is, I think, why Bill McKibben focuses so heavily on the petrochemical companies, because he sees them as the #1 target, but they're not the only ones. And there's lots of ways you can get at them if you're a part of a movement. But
you mentioned sort of the idea of companies having this kind of global impact, and I'm curious, and this is for any of you in a way, sort of jump in or something like that. But these companies are functioning globally. They are in these different places, and they're for anyone who's experienced this, they're very different depending on the company you're in. Excuse me, the country you're in. They will sort of face towards whatever the sort of majority is or opinion in that sort of place. And I'm curious, in a certain sense, what kind of structure, if we're going to have collective social action, how do we actually begin to do that? How do we make those decisions? There's different, at the scale of the nation, there's government ones, right? We have constitutions. Here, supposedly, we have democracy, and that's how we can participate in action larger. Martha talked about coming from an urban design background, but then that's obviously spinning out into policy and things like that. And, the consideration of urbanity is an interesting one, because you're thinking of an urban condition as an organism, in effect, that is both constituted of its constituent elements, but also is a kind of a singular in a certain sense, or has the larger collective thing. So I'm curious, and maybe you could start off with this, but how do we actually begin to create a constructed discourse between these different scales of operation that we actually need to have, that perhaps, and maybe you can, and then this, each of you could jump into it, that relative to what is today. I think that's one of the issues, right? And I'm going to give, this will be my, I'm on my soapbox a little here, is I actually think stuff just doesn't work. I'm quite cynical in many respects about things, I don't think we need to tweak it. I actually think we need to, we need to radically overhaul a lot of things. And that, and I think some of the tough questions are is a democracy even equipped to take on these problems? Should we have an autocratic regime? And things. Fair enough, but these are questions. So I'm interested in especially because you guys have had experiences, at this kind of global scale, how do we begin to build things? How do we begin to talk about these questions at these scales, both as it reflects on us as individuals, but also on these systems? And what systems have you guys seen that work versus ones that don't? What could be repurposed in a new way? And an old system that we don't have to destroy it, but we could think of it in a different way. Martha, maybe you could start.
That's a complicated question there. I think if you're looking at, the climate change and trying to address it, and government structures. I'll come from my own experience here, where, we have governments at the state and local levels that have taken very strong stands. So, for instance, New York City and New York State have made a commitment to reducing greenhouse gas levels, to 80% of the 2005 levels by 2050. And while we have a government, the national government, that is backing away from a lot of the commitments that we've made. I think when you talk about the systems, I mean, one of the things that is true at this point is that, many of our corporations are multinational corporations, and so while the U.S. nationally is sort of backing off, they know that, the rest of the world is embracing the need to address climate change. And so they're way ahead, in terms of sustainability strategies, most companies, and certainly have been very vocal, against the president and taken strong stands. In New York, I think that one of the things that I see as a big barrier is the way that the governments communicate and educate local people. And I find in New York they make it incredibly complicated, and so when you try to engage people, it's really hard. I mean, there's some wonderful companies that say, look, we know that your life is not about energy. We'll take care of your energy needs, and we'll help you and advise you and guide you. But even, there are assistance programs that are not well designed. They're not very accessible. The Mayor's Office of Sustainability here, they have an advertising campaign where they use a little birdie. Have any of you heard about the Mayor's Office of Sustainability birdie? Okay, a couple of you have.
Just because I attended a presentation by the person who runs that at an energy conference.
Right, but this is what I'm saying. I mean, they just don't do a good job of educating and engaging, and that's why it's wonderful that everybody's here, and there's a huge industry engaged in that. But I think for most of us that are, on the ground, this is the biggest problem. Is just information and engagement, and because people have to. It is local. I mean, mitigating climate change is local, really comes from, the individual, and everything that we discussed here, up to, cities taking policies and getting, building owners. In the case of New York, most of our greenhouse gas comes from buildings, so working with them and creating sticks as well as incentives.
Something?
Well, just actually, when you were talking about messaging, it really, I thought it was really interesting, because I think this and hearing the conversations before, obviously these are very emotional topics. They're very emotionally charged. And it reminded me, you can probably tell I have an accent. I'm originally Australian, if anyone guessed that. Someone asked if I was from Texas, and I was like, no, further to the south. I'm from the real deep south, Australia. So, but we had this road safety campaign. It was interesting, and it said, essentially, not important with the commercial, but it ended with a tagline. It said, don't be right, be smart. Don't be right, we're in the right in the car. No, be smart and avoid accidents. And I feel it's the same with this. Do we want to be right and sit around and say, well, we're so right? Or do we really want to be smart and message people and really try and move opinion? And I think that's particularly is so difficult. There is, I forgot the actor who plays the Fawns. What's his name again? Henry Winkler had a really interesting, I think, quote. He said, assumptions are the termites of relationships. Assumptions, and I think we have a lot of assumptions in this, that we think, especially if we want to build relationships, we go into so many assumptions. And how do we clarify that, make the messaging more clear that resonates with those people, not with ourselves, is key. Anyway, so that was just sort of a riff off your messaging comment.
So I'm curious, maybe from you guys, what are examples? You shared the one about in Australia, but can you guys maybe give some examples of things you think have been effective, especially in bridging that gap? Because I think that is, you shouted out Donald Trump, right, in response to autocracy.
Traditionally, the Greeks figured these things out. Democracy was the worst of all possible forms of government, but it was the most stable, whereas autocracy, I mean, yes, that would be the best, have a benevolent dictator, but it almost never works out. So.
Of course, but what I think is interesting, just in terms of a conversation, and most people, when you said Donald Trump, everyone kind of got what you were, the subtext to that, and everyone's sort of like, yeah, that guy. But we could be in a different room, and people would be like, yeah, what?
I was facetious.
No, I know, but I mean, I think that's interesting. So I'm particularly curious if you guys can maybe throw out some examples of things where dealing with the messaging that has to occur when you have to deal with that kind of incredible sort of breadth whether it's an extreme one like with the Israeli-Palestinian one, or even just, I think maybe in surprisingly more difficult is the subtle breadth, right, of the from one end of the spectrum to the other, and all the people in the middle, and the weird sort of confusing people who are like me, who are left-wing gun owners, and it's like, how do you even deal with someone like that, right? So I'm curious if you guys maybe have some examples from work that you've done, or things that you've been a part of, or things that you've seen where there's actually been great success in sort of taking on some of these sorts of things and overcoming some of these challenges.
I can give you an example from the perspective of movement building, and what I've seen has in the last 10, 20 years has been a more sophisticated transnational movement organizing, where it used to be hyper-local, then regional and national, more and more communities facing similar issues, and in some cases the same companies or corporations. So you have Chevron in Ecuador polluting the Amazon, the rainforest. You have Chevron in a company town in the Midwest, and those communities actually band together across their local areas in these translocal partnerships. They get international NGOs involved who are mostly in the global north with resources, and together they can come together to develop campaigns, really translocal campaigns that try to go after the company through litigation, policy making in their respective states, and reform. So they go, they do a multi-pronged attack to not just deal with their hyper-local issue, but deal with the source of the problem using multiple tactics and strategies. And that has been more effective than what the traditional organizing has been around just like a hyper-local approach. And I'll just raise one other one, which is an oldie but a goodie, which is e-waste, right? The Basel Convention was one of the earliest examples of how NGOs can tackle multinational corporations and a global problem, really. And really the source of the problem is the global north and our consumption of e-waste and dumping it in the global south. And the Basel Convention was really a multinational effort driven by NGOs and consumer groups. So it was a coalition of consumer groups who were aware and were targeting and were messaging to those companies and shaming them into the practices, into reforming their practices, but also a smart strategy of changing policy, changing law. So it wasn't perfect because you still need implementation, and this goes back to your question of democracy. When you want to implement any kind of law, if you don't have a healthy nation state with a participatory democracy, the hope for actually sustaining change, especially social change that speaks to the needs of people, if you don't have a healthy governance system in place, your hopes for a sustained implementation of any good policy is low. So at the end of the day, I believe you still need a healthy democracy, a robust democracy where the needs of people push back on other interests. And these are conflicting interests. These are not, things that we're going to agree or disagree. These are clashes of interests. So.
How, for example, in the Chevron example that you gave, how did that conversation start? How did someone I think you said Ecuador? Mm-hmm. How did someone in Ecuador and someone in Ohio even know that they should be talking to each other, and how do they do that?
Really, it's the work increasingly of NGOs. So many NGOs are now forming at, on a global basis. So they're networks of networks. They're, grassroots, Global Justice Alliance is one. There are many grassroots coalitions that try to bridge the global north and the global south actors, that are super local that would never, know about each other. And now today with social media, it is a lot. It gets easier to do that work. 30, 40 years ago, it was a lot harder. You had to find money to physically meet each other at conferences, mm-hmm. which for people in the global south was very, very costly and prohibitive. But with social media now, with documentarians, with so many forms and means of people communicating and finding each other, these NGOs are able to leverage, limited resources to connect these people.
Mark, I wonder if you could, if I don't know if you do, because we didn't prep this, but whether you maybe have some experiences of just seeing the shift over time, even with some of these things, these changes in technology, places that were once extremely isolated, that were often, I mean, for example, I lived in China in the early aughts, And it was still very much 20th century China when I moved there. I moved to Beijing, and it was, there were basically no cars except for government officials at that point, stuff like that. And, within 10 years, it was just literally and figuratively a completely different animal in terms of the communications in and out, in terms of all the different things. So I'm curious if there's, maybe some examples that you've seen or something like that, but that also sort of engage that in those sort of shifts, those sort of things that, again, part of what I'm kind of interested in is the things that we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Like, what things can we carry away from the 20th century, from neoliberalism, from capitalism, from all these things that we should keep, because otherwise we'll have nothing and we'll be adrift. And then what are the things that are changing that we can perhaps grasp onto that gives it, that's because I think that's fascinating, that just the social media thing has potentially opened up empowered NGOs in a way that they really maybe weren't, or liberated them from sort of national concerns in a way they weren't. I don't know if there's something you might.
Yeah, well, definitely. When I went over to the former Soviet bloc in 1990, the countries that I was working in, they basically didn't have, functioning telecommunication systems. I was in Gdańsk, and there was one phone in the city hall that could call down to Warsaw. And in a couple of years, they didn't build up, the telephone lines. Everyone went to cell phones. And so all of a sudden you had all of this communication, and very rapidly, people picked this up. I also feel that, people in the Soviet bloc are a lot more engineers than here, a lot more people in telecommunications, and they very quickly, moved that along and moved along a lot of the technology. I was working in urban planning, so, they developed GIS, and, more quickly than over there. We used to bring over consultants, to do a lot of the technical work, and I'm like, forget it. It's like I have these students that I'm working with that are almost, so much better than any of these consultants that we're bringing over. So that was very important. And the other thing that I was doing was developing a regional movement. So as working in planning, I worked in developing the real estate markets. So we very quickly, because of this, rapid, evolution of the communications, we set up regional real estate associations and training. And so I watched things change, whole, practice, rule of law in a very short period of time. And the one reason also was because of urgency, because these were systems that had collapsed and they had to rebuild. And I remember Balcerowicz, who had been the Minister of Finance, said, people say that they would like things to be the way that it was, but that's not an option. We can never have things the way that it was. We're moving ahead, we have to evolve. And this, again, this is a very important message on climate change, that anybody that has their head in the sand right now and whether they're, Republicans or, oil
Other
companies.
Republicans.
Pardon me?
Or other Republicans.
Other Republicans, or, whoever they are, if they, have a vested financial interest, they have to agree that that we have to move ahead and do something, and most of them do.
Well, maybe to swing it around to the brand thing, or like companies actually a little bit more, because, I've heard a couple of people talking, about oil and all that stuff, and the sort of, that's the really sort of bad thing. And then we talk about, okay, social media, and that's tech, and like, tech, they're saving the world. But in reality, I think, my opinion is that there, in many, we talk, e-waste came up. I always start one of my classes by asking who's evil. And, nobody ever volunteers, and, then I ask if you have a cell phone. It's like, it's all that kind of stuff. So I think one of the questions also, and maybe, you guys can start in, hopefully a little bit, is like, how much do these companies actually even really care, right? Like, Apple gets away with pretending like they care a lot, whereas Exxon is just sort of like, quit yelling at us, right? But in reality, Apple kind of gets a pass. There's all these companies that, a couple conversations, and Kim and I've worked with Nike, and they're sort of like, they come out with a bunch of stuff, but it's like, how much are they really actually doing in terms of these things, and who's getting a pass in terms of what purely because they're better branded in a certain sense?
Yes, it's because they're better branded.
So it's all just because you branded them better that they're getting away with destroying the world? Is this your fault at the end of the day?
It's like, I'm listening to all these things and trying to have a good answer. But the reality of it is corporations rarely change unless it affects their profits, period. So the sort of move towards any sort of like social good, whether it be in the food industry where foods are now healthier or products that are greener, none of this is true. It's because they've done a ton of market research and understand that that's the messaging that the market is reacting to, and how do they pivot their brand. And either competitors are coming into the space and starting to steal market share, and then they're reacting to that. It is rarely different for the big sort of national conglomerates that have existed for 30 plus years. What's interesting is the new companies that are emerging that have a sort of broader sense of purpose and are launched with this sort of social good at core. Those are the ones that are actually impacting meaningful change, but there's still not a complete sense of transparency and, to your point, responsibility in understanding what it goes to create the things that we use. Because at the end of the day, none of us need as much shit as we use, and that's a really hard thing for people to admit.
And we wanting more shit too.
Just when you said nothing's changed, you mean because it's cosmetic, when they get their market research that they should do it, but they don't actually do it? Or
Yeah, because it's really hard. The cost of doing business to change is really hard. I mean, the millions of dollars that a company would have to invest to simply change a form of packaging, whether it's just like tabs on cans, is astronomical, much less change product, how products are developed or sourced, et cetera. Like, it is really hard and really expensive, but changing labels and doing a new ad campaign, relatively much cheaper.
Now, we're all depressed now. I was just thinking of some examples.
One of the difficulties is that there is a tremendous amount of verbiage and information coming out that's very sophisticated, very slick, by people who do nothing but write copy, and it's all there not to be clear. It's all to bamboozle you in whatever way that you should buy the product. And the problem is that it gets very hard to talk about meaningful things within that realm of bubble.
Right.
But and that's really exists out there. You try to talk to someone, and really what you're getting is 50 years of ads or whatever that they've been watching. It's really kind of sad.
But I would argue, just within the context, that also is, again, this is a conversation that's often skewed. I think there's a huge amount of branding, at least at the political level, that's taking place with the left wing to convince the left wing to be sort of happy and safe in their sort of, right wing kind of, or excuse me, left wing sort of coastal practices, and not necessarily engage the hard problems too, which to me isn't that much different than these corporate things. It's like, we'll attack this problem because we can, but, I don't want to deal with those weirdos because I don't agree. David, was there something you were going to?
Again, Martha's question, I think you're about positive examples of what would be positive, and again, it depends where you sit, I guess. I always spent a lot of time working in the UK last year. I was thinking two campaigns, obviously the Brexit, the exit of the European Union, as well as the Scottish national movement, as successful movements. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, as I said, I'm Australian, we spent a lot of time in the UK. I mean, these were marginal, these were jokes, both of them, like to leave the European Union and for Scottish independence. And obviously the Scots just got voted down. But why were those successful? I mean, what were the principles we can learn in terms of sustainability? And at least I was there during the Brexit vote. When we talk about communications and messaging, I don't know if people remember when they had, we used to say in politics, you can't beat something with nothing, right? And people want to return to something, or they feel some nostalgic or real emotional connection. And I was there when they had, I don't know if people remember, there an advertisement, it was for the pro-Brexit, about refugees, and it had a picture of all these refugees, sort of a big line of refugees, and sort of as a warning. And the whole, I don't know if does anyone remember that? I mean, it was sort of a mislabeled photograph, had nothing to do, it was a different situation, different country, but it was giving the idea that these are people trying to enter the UK. Mm-hmm. But that certainly was seen as critical, and I think getting it to just intellectual, here's some facts and talking points, to an emotional connection, at least for certain people. Mm-hmm. And actually the reverse side, domestic campaign, I think might be another interesting example, is a marriage equality movement, which again, 20, 30 years ago, how did that so successful? And I was speaking to someone from GLAAD, one of the organizers there, and they said, they purposefully had to make a decision whether to go for civil union or marriage equality. Mm-hmm. And obviously the marriage equality was a more ambitious goal, but they decided that to frame in the way that it was a human rights for everyone, and if they don't allow this, then who's to say your rights was a conscious decision, and even was more ambitious, was much more successful than just saying human rights, and this is civil unions are, and this is about us. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I was just thinking about maybe positive examples,
No,
and what can we learn from them
And I'd
for
be interested to
sustainability.
take that further, actually, because I think that's actually extremely interesting. And I like that example in part because it sort of talks about how we have to, I mean, it's advertising too, right? You know, it's like, let's mobilize these things for the things that we believe. I mean, I'm a big believer that, over the last 20, 30 years, the right has done an excellent job in the United States. Really, well done. Because they've actually gotten their message out and they've sold it in a way that it should. So there was a question that came from the audience, which was about Nestle as a quote-unquote perfect example of destructive practices obfuscated by marketing. Now, I don't know if anyone here can speak specifically about Nestle, but I think in terms of a conversation point, starting point, what are ways that we can actually begin to, what are their positive examples, whether they're actual ones or maybe things we've seen that failed that could have been handled a different way, or like what are those sort of inflection points that where we actually can, and that might be something that happens at a very local level or something that happens at a at a kind of a corporate level or whatever. But what do you guys think about those kind of things? If you know about Nestle specifically, how could we begin to tackle that, but also more broadly if you don't.
So I think this is about the campaign in South America, where they've been selling all of these products and the obesity rates have gone up. I mean, one way of countering that, we're all talking about, there's a need for information, the calories, make sure people are aware of the calories and what's really in this food. I found I skimmed the article. It was a horrifying article because they actually had women pushing shopping carts with all these packages of candy and horrible food that, I think most of us probably don't eat. And then they gave, indications of, rising obesity rates.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in here that it's not reading the packaging. I mean, Nestle is an embodiment of eco-colonialism. I mean, many of these companies now, instead of having, these European powers land on your shores and colonize your land and kick people off their land, now it's companies that go, enter markets, basically appropriate land and water and resources and privatize them, commodify them, monetize them, sell them back to you as processed goods that make you sick, and it feeds this vicious cycle of continuing to exploit people and continuing to colonize people and monetize people and really dispossess them of their land and of their natural resources. So Nestle and there's other examples, Coca-Cola in India with the water movement, and the thing that's exciting to me about the movements responding to this are that they're not responding as consumers. They're responding as environmentalism of the poor. That people are responding as we rely on these natural resources not just for profit making, but for life. For our cultural survival, in some cases for our survival period. And that's a very powerful movement because all of a sudden, relatively small movements of people, because it's not everyone, a lot of the times it's rural, marginalized populations, indigenous populations that are quite remote. We're not talking about huge numbers of people, but they're effective enough in their appeal. They have a spotlight that they can shine on the issue that no one else really has access, a lot of other people don't have access to, particularly in the global north as consumers. We have bought into this notion of ourselves as atomized consumers. And I think the people in the global south, the indigenous cultures, the frontline communities are reminding us that we're not just consumers. We actually are agents. We can be social change agents when we have a connection to a place. And we have a connection to the natural resources that make our lives possible. So to me, what's exciting is that those frontline communities can shine the spotlight on a thing like Nestle that we may never question in our daily lives, and help us think about how do I connect either through NGOs or through networks of other people. Maybe it's through my own branding or social media that I have access to in the global north. I have resources that other people don't have resources to. How do I link up to a campaign that's targeted to Nestle? And the people in the global south couldn't do that on their own.
Can we take that a step further, actually, though, and ask, you're saying, okay, how do we do that? Because there's the sort of archetypal thing of like, oh, well, I liked on Facebook that disaster photo. Like, I'm passing it through, like, I've done my bit, now I'm going to go have a chocolate bar. But I'm going to have, like, dark chocolate from Switzerland because I don't eat Nestle. But,
So my question is, so what do we do? Do people know that Nestle owns Poets, Sprint, and God knows whatever else, and Carnation and everything else, which is again water, and yet they're taking public water out of the river and then reselling and selling it to people whose water has been contaminated. So
Yeah, and this is again where democracy can come in too, because do we have nation states that promote or inhibit that type of behavior?
But I want to take it slightly more personal, like back to, let's say, the people in this room, because we're sitting in, preposterously expensive institution in a preposterously expensive city, sort of whinging about these things, and but like, what is our role? Really, because we talked earlier today about our role as kind of individuals in our community, but relative to things, and when I say our role, I mean our role, like, relatively entitled, this sort of first world, but who do care. But how do we not just end up liking crap on Facebook, and then sort of going about our day? Like, what can we actually do in a proactive way that actually will empower both these other people, spread the message, do whatever? I don't know. Like, what can we really do?
Maybe not necessarily an answer, but more of a provocation, sort of build on that as we're talking about this. And we think, again, obviously operating from a place of extreme privilege compared to the rest of the world. If I decide that I don't want Nestle products anymore, or I'm not going to drink soda because it's bad for me, all these other things, all these companies are going to do is then sell it to the Chinese market, right? It doesn't actually help the world. So this is where the real struggle starts to come in, and then this sort of general veneer of social good that you're sort of talking about with a very passive oh, I'm going to like this on Facebook and I feel like I've done something yet still hasn't done something. I don't know. I think there's a real tension in terms of what it means to be an American consumer, in the sense of actually you have a global responsibility, because the things that we're doing in our practices of consumerism have wide effects globally, even in terms of just how culture is influenced, that I don't think really gets talked about or addressed, right? Everything is on the brand and the companies that are creating all these bad situations, but not responsibility on the individual consumer.
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I would just mention that you should, we are extremely privileged, and knowing that you're privileged is the first step towards solving the problem and acknowledging that privilege and then leveraging the privilege. What do you have? You have money, give money to the organizations that are running these campaigns in the Global South, or even international NGOs that are working on these issues. Give to the people in Flint who are fighting for the legislation to stop Nestle from extracting water. If you have resources like skills, you've gone to a new school, you have technical or specific skill sets that you can participate in campaigns directly or indirectly. So share your wealth, share your privilege, leverage it, because I think we get lazy with the social media, thinking that social media is going to solve it, or technology is going to solve it. You still have to think of yourself as a social change agent. And that's where I think we have to break out of this atomized vision of ourselves. We focus only on carbon molecules and we focus only on consumers as individuals. But really, it's the difference is when consumers act as a collective that you make a difference. And the more you associate yourself and generate those connections with larger groups or larger campaigns, the more effective I think you can leverage your own individual power.
How real is that, do you guys think, that the consumer power is, really? Because you kind of alluded to maybe the idea that maybe it's not as strong as we think, right? Like you said, we don't buy it, they sell it to the Chinese. I mean, I think, cigarettes is a great example of that, right? Where they come out and they're like, yeah, we're going to not be making any cigarettes. But I know from working in Asia, like they're like, pot, more cigarettes, smoke more, and it's like, we'll just make it up somewhere else. Like, how is that even realistic to vote with our credit cards, as it were, or something like that? Or is that just kind of a yet another example of us sort of feeling good about it? Do we need a more radical sort of intervention in? You need to be off record to answer this question.
No, I just feel like it's, I'm laughing because it's a very cynical conversation, because I can't think of a good, right, you know what I mean? Like, what is the answer? Because in some cases, yes, your wallet does matter. Like, Uber was in trouble a while ago, they're in trouble based on how they behaved, and consumers were like, oh, I'm just gonna find another solution, and it actually affected how they did business in some capacity. So it's not to say that there isn't that tie between consumerism and change. It's just when you're starting to deal with these huge corporations that aren't as sort of responsive, right? Like, I can go on, like, the ability to opt out of Uber is very easy. The ability to opt out of where your groceries come from, not so much, right? So, like, how do you start to drive change with things that are a little bit harder to do? And then one of the things that I sort of keep coming back to as one of the big challenges of these discussions, it's like a lot of things are missing. So there's no sense of cohesion because media is completely fractured. The messages that we get are fractured. They're uber filtered. People can't even align on the problem, the single problem or single solution that you have to solve. And then one of the biggest issues now, particularly in America, but in other places, like, what is actually the truth, right? Like, what is a truth versus liberal media or right-wing media slanting something? So there's an absence of truth, an absence of cohesion, and an absence of a single-minded goal. So I think there needs to be, you know, we keep talking about action, but a lot of it is a problem of sort of like communication and alignment and just getting much better strategies around that so we can actually make change.
Who can do that?
Mark Zuckerberg, once he gets rid of his weird algorithm. Just kidding. No, but like he is actually running for president. But like the sort of forces of media that are operating under these algorithms and feeding us all the same information are almost like the front lines of what our truth is right now and how we unite right now. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting.
I think fundamentally it's in the structure of the fabric that we've grown up with and we can't separate. But what's interesting is that we live in a very anomality. So what happened after World War II is bizarre and has never happened before, where everybody became a king and queen, and it will die again as well. And this Earth can't wait because we may not be around because of it, but we have to look at ourselves as anomality because we don't want to do that. Right. We're all going to fall together. But I didn't want to be pessimistic.
No, I'm totally on board with that worldview, actually. But there was a question I was asking. I want to throw this out because we're closing in on the end of the sort of official panel part. The question was about, if I got this right, was actually about this sort of emotive, charismatic, quote unquote, megafauna advertising, right? This sort of idea that we save all the leopards but screw everybody else. So people give. I hope I'm getting that right with what that is. So the question then was, what are potential examples of better ways to kind of use that kind of emotive, and I'm going to add not a twist to it, but maybe a shade to it or an extra piece to that, which is, the question of, this kind of goes to almost a little bit what you're saying of like, how do we decide, what are these systems, how do we strategize? Like, there's so many things, and there's been a lot of stuff lately talking about, if you listen to, Gladwell or Freakonomics or any of those things, they're always talking about stuff that like doesn't work like it's supposed to. And I think this is one of the big things we face. Like, even a lot of well-intentioned efforts on all of our parts go wildly awry and do exactly the opposite of what they thought that, we thought that they would. So I'm curious, not so much, certainly if you guys have some examples, that would be awesome, but also, what do we need? Part of what was remarkable about the idea of democracy was it, so, as you said, it doesn't necessarily work, but it works better than everything else, right? And so how do we begin to think about what kind of systems, the ambitions that each of you have sort of articulated maybe for things, or the flaws in things, like what kind of systems, what kind of models of communication, what kind of conversations, what kind of ad campaigns, like just, as we're sort of closing in on the end of this part of the panel, like what kind of things can we actually put out there? Where does it work? Whether it's an actual example or an abstraction of it, like what would be something that you guys think is like, look, we could do this. What should I go out today and start actually doing that can, impact these kinds of things? Just quickly, if each of you could explain how to save the world, that would be cool.
You want to start here? Yeah.
That's all I'm looking for here, people. Come on.
Okay. So just two things to throw out, not in the academic research, but in terms of mindsets, I think that Philip Tetlock, if people are familiar with his work, a political science professor, in terms of, he wrote a book, Super Forecasters, sort of distilled his research over the last 20 years about what is sort of the mindset to be able to predict the future and sort of this thing of communication and the idea of, self-checking, self-correction. He examined pundits and those that sort of gave large predictions, those gave small predictions, and so he kind of outlined that sort of internal doubt that I think is the right communication mindset for these sort of things. As you said, quite rightly, we come up with the best idea, guys, but unintended consequences is completely negative. And to constantly be in that mindset of predicting and checking your predictions, I think is really the best thing I've ever read and supported by decades of empirical research. The second thing, and I think it touches in terms of systems, I would just throw out, in some ways an optimist. I think, building coalitions, that's the work I did in advocacy in the Middle East, bringing together left and right-wing people, I think is definitely possible above the individual level, as you said. Although I do think, maybe the pessimist in me, that people are still driven in a lot of ways by self-interest. Doesn't necessarily have to be about money and capitalism, but self-interest in some ways. And so companies and other stakeholders can be part of that coalition in the right way. And again, some of our we've brought on projects with large pharmaceutical companies that decided to, we were just talking about this example before, handle a social innovation challenge. One, it was really more for their marketing engagement of their employees rather than I think that they really cared so much. But when it was put to them in terms of where market is going, what things are happening, they really embraced it, and I think sincerely, and they were instrumental part of that coalition.
Who put that to them?
It was sort of a combination of us, one of the people on there, and again, we can get into some of the politics. They had somebody internally that was sort of a champion, and then us that were able to raise them up and sort of frame that. And I think the last thing I'd say from the politics side is we often talk about the 3 M's in politics. So mapping who are the influential people within these different organization systems. So for example, that was a champion and they had a lot of influence. What's the right message? Everything we talked about before, what resonates with them and not with necessarily ourselves. And then finally, I think the messenger is always important. Who has the maximum credibility with that audience that you're trying to persuade? Not always the people here in this room should be the people that are delivering these messages.
Anybody else got the answer?
We're at the new school, so, and I'm an educator. Probably many of you are educators in your own right in some way. And we're at the home of John Dewey, whose core belief was that we need to go back to educating people not to be cogs in the wheel, but to be fully engaged citizens of the world and of the society that they're part of, and not to just see themselves as part of the industrial complex where they're just gaining a scale and putting it out in the world and producing cogs. And so, what I think we should do is to, educate in whether you're an educator in a formal sense or in your own community, in your own family, that you develop deep sense of collectivism and connection and connectedness through networks, through your familial networks, through your social networks, and through your connections to home, and educate young people on how to feel a sense of connectedness and citizenship. Like, what do we owe each other? Not just what do I need, but what do we owe each other? Which is, sort of a different ethic of care that we don't touch on a lot. The second thing is organize. I think going back to political systems, educate. We don't teach or we don't pay attention to the political systems of power. Where does power reside? And how do I, access those channels of power? And for poor people and people of color in this country, those channels have been through organizing. Wealthy people, white people have other channels, but in my community where I grew up, you have to organize political base of people, because people power is the only thing that we have to leverage against, to make a difference in the political system, to make change at the political level. And then the third thing is resist, which is learning how to resist the dominant discourse of consume, 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 more, 24/7, 7 days a week. And I really believe that the more we are conscious of ourselves as not just individuals, but as part of a collective, and that we start to envision alternative futures, You know, and I think frontline communities, again, help us envision an alternative future, because this society has never worked for people of color in frontline communities. It's failing for them today, and it will fail for them in the future unless we envision an alternative future. And so always finding hope at the margins and finding a discourse of resistance, that we're not going to just lay down and let climate change kill us.
That's very different from the leaders of the world who couldn't, including Obama, who couldn't imagine a world that didn't do that. If you listen to their when they came together in Paris, and they couldn't imagine a world that couldn't exploit third world countries and for the resources and everything else. It's just pretty amazing. It's a world of living.
There are successes. There are things that you'll be arrested if you own them. Ivory, child porn, shrunken heads. Yeah, cannibalism, you know, like
BPA?
it used to be if you had a drink, prohibition, but that was a little bit ambitious.
That didn't work so well.
Right, but the other
Luckily.
the other ones are working. I mean, they're extreme examples, but that shows you can do something like that. You can prevent.
Yeah, I think.
The fear. I don't want ivory near me because I know something important.
But there are also people that are, you know, especially in places where that's actually a player, that are actually, you know, sort of key players and really are part of that. Going back to some of the examples here, you know, that were leaders. I was actually not too long ago in Zimbabwe, and I was in this storehouse that was just filled with ivory, like insane amounts. But no, you shake your head. But see, the point is actually, it's very much a good thing, because what's happening is, if this is someone who's actually an important artist in the country, and they have actually sort of created this awareness. And so, because they're respected, because they're the right agent, people who are finding these things, it might just be drop-offs of tusks or whatever, are bringing it to this person, and it's actually being stored, and they're actually playing a role relative to the government. And so it's actually, you know, a very locally driven, what's happening is these people, because they're empowered because of that network, are resisting any kind of poaching and sort of pushing that down. So it's had a huge impact because they've created a way for the ivory to be, you know, which in many cases it's just an elephant that died or something to move, you know. And I'm not saying I know there's a lot of bad stuff, don't get me wrong,
No,
but.
that's not it, but one of the arguments against that, and even the ivory burning, is the fact that now it's more scarce, which means it drives the prices up.
But actually, it's the opposite of that. They're not burning it. They're not destroying it. They're actually allowing it to be used in reasonable ways and, you know, managing it, you know, as reasonably. My point in all this is there's a sort of cultural shift that takes place, which I think, and we're going to have to kind of close out, but I think that's actually one of the important things, because if I sort of took everything everyone has said, what it actually all is really about is, how do we get to a place where we actually do have a collective cultural shift? And, you know, for my own part, I mean, I've often been accused of being a cynical optimist, and I think that pretty reasonably characterizes my personality. And so the optimist side of me would actually say this, which is that just automatically operate on the principle that you don't know what you're doing and you don't know what you're talking about. And instead, at least once each day, try to go out in the world and find somebody who you think you understand, who you actually don't, and learn something from them, and then figure out how you can change your behavior, even if it's only incrementally, to actually embrace a world in which that person has just as much agency as you do. And I'm not talking about someone necessarily less empowered or more. I'm just talking about the fact that we're all so different. And I think sometimes we get caught in our own feedback loops. And, you know, my answer to the question I posed would be communication. At all levels. If we can actually learn to communicate, if we can build systems where we can communicate honestly instead of, you know, with no transparency, I think this is a solvable problem. And if not, I think we're all screwed. I think we have the space for another half an hour. Am I right on that? But a half an hour we have to really be out, so we'll be sort of shoved. So feel free, you know, circulate around and chat and do whatever, but we do have to get out pretty soon. Thank you so much to the panel, everybody else who did everything. Thank you all for coming. Do you want to say something? I think Boris has one closing thing, but we hope that you guys will continue to be involved with what we've been trying to do.